I grew up in northeast Pennsylvania, Luzerne County, coal mining country, a child of the 60s. A simpler time, as some say. A simpler time. But was it? I suppose it depends on who you speak to and what part of our world they were in at the time. I've heard plenty of stories about life in my neck of the woods from decades before that. The 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. Stories like the women stayed home, took care of all the household chores, laundry, meals, kids, etc. I grew up through some of that. I'll tell you what, they definitely weren't watching soap operas or chatting on social media all day or paying a housekeeper to clean their house. Household chores were a mite tougher then. Laundry for a lot of women in our area, pre-1960s, meant filling a wash tub with water and soap, scrubbing the clothes on a washboard, wringing each piece of clothes out by hand, or run it through a hand-cranked roller to squeeze out the water. When you were done, you went out to the backyard and hung each piece of clothes on a clothesline with clothespins to air dry. If they happened to get wet from a passing rainstorm, then you squeezed them out and hung them up back outside. Imagine how long that took and how physical that was to do repeatedly. I know because when I was a wee tyke, I remember my grandmother and great-grandmother doing it. And that was just one chore. Don't get me started on cleaning the house, making all the meals, taking care of the kids, etc., etc. Now, in the 1960s, in my area, that was still the practice in some households. But so-called modern conveniences were beginning to enter the market if you could afford them. The scrubbing of the clothes, for the most part, was fading out. If you were the man of the house, you were the breadwinner. In the early 1900s through 1940 or so, if you were lucky, you found a job above ground. I say lucky because jobs above ground weren't that common in our county. Most men settled into the fact that they had to work in the coal mines, of which there was no shortage of. Our area was anthracite coal. It was a hard coal and in demand. The men started early and worked late. It was very hard physical work. Dangerous too. Explosions, floods, dangerous gases. All this for not much pay. And to make things even worse, in the early years, the only real place to spend your money on groceries and other items that you needed was at the company store, which just so happened to be owned by the mining company. Yeah. So most of your small pay went back to the mine. Young kids were trained and disciplined and knew there was no going out to play before all your chores were done, and schoolwork if they were of age. Slightly older boys had it a mite tougher. That leads me to the main focus of my story. Young lads were often forced to work in the mines as well. Not deep down where their daddies were, but near ground level. As the menfolk drilled and picked the coal, they would throw the chunks into coal cars on rails. When the coal cars were full, they were sent up from deep down in the mines and dumped into an apparatus called a breaker, where they were busted up into smaller pieces. Depending on the particular usage for them, the pieces needed to be separated to sell. I've heard stories of these breaker boys as I grew older. I never witnessed it, but it's well documented. These young lads I mentioned earlier came to work just as early as the men and worked just as late. Their job, as seen in the images, was to sit all day and separate coal chunks as they slid down chutes or conveyor belts to them. They also needed to toss out any impurities, such as rocks, clay, and soil that didn't belong. Basically anything that wasn't coal. They were forced to work without gloves so they could better handle the slick coal. Breaker boys sometimes had their fingers amputated by the rapidly moving conveyor belts. Others lost feet, hands, arms, and legs as they moved among the machinery and became caught underneath the conveyor belts or in gear. The dry coal would kick up so much dust that the breaker boys sometimes wore lamps on their heads just to see. Standing watch over them was at least one adult male with a stick to make sure things were running smoothly. They usually worked 10 hours per day for less than 50 cents. If that isn't shocking enough, know that these boys were generally ages 7 to 12, sitting hunched over all that time, every day, thirsty as hell, and breathing in all that coal dust. They went home at night covered in as much black coal dust as their daddies. The part of the mining operation they worked in was called a breaker, hence the reason the young'uns became known as the Breaker Boys. I've heard numerous stories about what went on those mines. In a future story, I just may share some more if you like. But as I was saying, I've heard a lot of stories from my grandfather, stories from other folks I know and have known, looking at lots of photos and reading a lot on the subject. Most of the stories were just terrible and hard to imagine. But the one that stuck out in my mind throughout all my 60-plus years on God's earth were the stories and images of the Breaker Boys. And kids think they have it tough these days when they're told no TV for a day or no phone or video games for a couple of days. Yes, I know, some of you may say those were different times. Different times? Yes. But kids are still kids. I appreciate when I grew up and the tough times we lived through. I look back thankful I grew up too late to be part of those mines, but grateful to have it shared to me by my family that lived it. Thank you for listening. Until we chat again, I'm John Knapko.